Welcome to Sarder TV, an idea-sharing platform founded by Russell Sarder, who's an author, investor, and the CEO of Netcom Learning. We're excited to have Touraj Parang join us today. Touraj has worked in Silicon Valley since the late 1990s. He's been involved in hundreds of M&A and venture capital deals. Currently, he's the COO of Serve Robotics, and he's also the author of a new book called Exit Path: How to Win the Startup Endgame. And he's here to tell us more. Touraj, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here today.
It's my pleasure. I'm pleased to be here.
So start off by telling us a little about yourself and your background and your career journey.
Yes, absolutely. So, I've been around Silicon Valley since the late 90s. Actually, I fell in love with the Valley when I was an undergrad at Stanford in mid-90s. And the environment, the entrepreneurial spirit, the innovative spirit was all that just captured my imagination. I did my hand at trying to code and take a couple of programming courses because of that. And I just realized that my brain is not wired to be a coder. So I did the next best thing. I majored in philosophy and economics. And then I went to law school with the hope and aspiration that I would come back and represent technology startups. And that's what I did. I came back in the late 90s, worked at Wilson Sonsini, one of the premier law firms representing founders from formation all the way to IPOs and M&A. And that was a bit of a baptism by fire. So it was late 90s, we were doing IPOs, one IPO a week, a couple of M&A deals a week. In fact, the first week as a lowly associate, I was staffed on like 5 major acquisitions. So I got a bit of a burnout and realized that I actually wanted to be much closer to the technology and innovation than to be on the legal side, which is a step removed from the real action. So I tried to figure out a way to get out of the legal profession. I networked with the alumni network of Stanford, and luckily I got a position at a venture capital firm, a European venture capital firm that wanted to open an office here in Palo Alto. So that was my first shot at being on the business side. Kind of got a front row seat to reviewing a lot of business plans, seeing how boards of startups actually worked, and how entrepreneurs kind of created this ecosystem of relationships around themselves to kind of grow their business. And that was really eye-opening. I like to say I got an MBA on the job. And, at some point, eventually, I summoned up the courage to start my own company. So that was Jackster in 2005, which was a mobile social network and communication startup. We had a crazy wild run. Unfortunately, we hit the 2008-2009 downturn. We made a couple of key strategic mistakes, and we paid for those mistakes. I tried not to repeat those mistakes with my next startups and got radically different results. So I've done a few startups now. I've sold all of them. I also went to the acquirer side because I didn't have that experience, and I wanted to really see how are these deals done. And so I joined GoDaddy before the IPO and was with them for 7 years. I joined because of what I wanted to learn, and also because the mission really resonated with me, which was to tilt the global economy towards a small business. And I've always owned small businesses. My parents have owned small businesses. And it just sort of really resonated with me. But I stayed because of culture and because we had so much fun, and the team was phenomenal. Stayed there for 7 years, and then joined my good friend, with whom I had actually started a venture that we sold to Postmates, who had then run a startup within Postmates. Postmates, for those of your listeners that don't know, is a food delivery company competing with DoorDash and Uber Eats. And they had started a robotics division called Serve. And these are these cute robots that those of your listeners or viewers in LA may have seen them. They're very popular on social media. They deliver food on the sidewalks. They're autonomous robots. And I joined my friend Ali about 18 months ago to spin out Serve from within Postmates and Uber, who subsequently had acquired Postmates, and make it an independent company. And I'm the president and COO there for the past 18 months.
So your role as COO of and president of Serve Robotics, which focuses on sustainable delivery, right? Tell us a little bit more about the organization and what your sort of mission is.
Yes. So, as I mentioned, Serve was started within Postmates as a way to augment the human fleet. We had even back in 2017 when the project started, we had realized that human supply is limited, and also we are very inefficient the way we do food deliveries. What we like to say is that why move a 2-pound burrito in a 2-ton car, right? You have a human driver, and all this, inefficiency goes into moving, an item of food or convenience or grocery from just a mile away. So it seems extremely inefficient, costly, which translates into expenses for both the restaurants, the vendors, the merchants, as well as the customers, as well as it's not great for environment. Cars cause a lot of accidents, congestion, noise. There are all these issues involved with delivering the way we did it traditionally for the past, I would say, 50 to 70 years. So at Serve, our mission is to disrupt that, to change that, make it a lot more efficient using robots that are autonomous on the sidewalks. And the reason we spun it out of Postmates and Uber is that this is a massive opportunity that serves many, many verticals. It can transform our cities. It can really improve our lives. And we are better as an independent company that can apply all these applications, achieve scale, rather than be unique to just one player in the industry. And to their credit, Uber saw that. And they're, a strategic investor and, of course, a key partner. But we are also working with many, many platforms, including 7-Eleven and others.
That's great. And how's it going so far?
It's been very exciting. I love seeing these videos on TikTok and Instagram and social media. People are just delighted when they see these robots on the sidewalks. A couple of common things we hear about them is that they're cute. You can think of it as a marriage between WALL-E and a Minion, and they are also very futuristic. So a lot of #future is very commonly associated with these robots. So it's been great.
So you recently wrote a book, Exit Path: How to Win the Startup Endgame. Tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Yes. So, that first startup experience I mentioned with Jackster was a wake-up call for me. We were very successful in the beginning. So we had found a product market fit. We had found an opportunity that existed in the market, which was bringing free texting and free calling to mobile phones. At that time, it was a prehistoric, pre-iPhone era. Mobile phones were not smart, and they didn't have any apps on them. And you would have to pay per text message, and long distance calls were so expensive, students couldn't even call back home. So we wanted to change that. We realized that also social media was very popular, growing in popularity. Places like MySpace, Friendster, Facebook was just getting started. People love to be interacting on these social media platforms. And again, they were not on phones. So we wanted to bridge the gap between the two. So we put out this widget that you could place on your MySpace profile, and people could call you from that. And also it would ring your phone, it would ring their phone. We would bridge the calls over the internet together. And they could also send text messages to you, and it was all free. So it grew pretty rapidly. We went from 0 to 10 million users in the first year of launching. And we got pretty arrogant, and we've said, look, we have $1 billion company here in the making. We don't need to distract ourselves with strategic partnerships or courting potential acquirers, building relationships. We're just going to put our heads down, execute, tune our viral engines, and go for gold. Well, little that we knew, the recession was around the corner. 2008, 2009 hit. Not unlike the times we are in today, where venture capital all of a sudden dries up. We had the top tier VCs on our wish list, on our cap table, but they weren't investing anymore. We couldn't get any new money. And we had a very short runway to try to sell the startup. It was less than a year. In fact, it was just 6 months by the time we figured everything out. And it was just too late to try and build a relationship and have a meaningful exit. I came to learn that subsequently. So we had to do a fire sale. We had one potential acquirer. They basically named their price, because the alternative was to shut down the company. And so it was even, I think pennies on the dollar would be a generous way of putting it. It was a very painful experience. I went back and licked my wounds for 6 months, reflected on what had happened, and realized that there was one key strategic decision that was the culprit potentially. So I tested that hypothesis with my next startup. The first thing I did with webs.com, where I joined as the head of strategy and corporate development, was to not repeat the same mistake. So we had an offsite, weekend-long offsite, miles away from the office. And we sat down and started really thinking about what does it take to succeed? What does success even mean for us as an entity, as a team? What does it mean for our startups, investors, or other stakeholders? And then we came up with a wish list of potential acquirers, started thinking about what makes someone get on the wish list, why do we think so, and how do we rank and prioritize these acquirers against each other? And what would make us attractive to these guys? A lot of good thinking and brainstorming went into that offsite. And the result of that was that within 2 years from that event, we were able to build strategic relationships with these potential acquirers and nurture those relationships to the level that within 2 years, they were excited to actually acquire us. We had multiple public and private companies bidding on us right before we had to raise another round of financing. And when one of them made an offer we couldn't refuse, we tied the knot with them. That was Vistaprint at a very premium valuation, again, because if you're in a competitive process, you sort of have a lot of leverage. And it was more than 10x forward revenues, which is over $100 million at that time. It was a very meaningful outcome for everyone involved, founders, investors, employees. And I sort of, that planted the thought that, look, we did something right here, which was radically different outcome from what I got with my first startup. And I tried to then sort of teach that lesson to other entrepreneurs that I invested in or mentored. I'm part of the Pear VC community. Pear is an early stage fund that focuses on a lot of first-time entrepreneurs. And I have been coaching and mentoring a number of those entrepreneurs and seeing the fruits of, again, this kind of strategic thinking. So I sort of started dawning on me that I have a very unique perspective, having been on multiple seats, lawyer, investor, mentor, buyer, acquirer at GoDaddy, as well as seller of startups, that I can bring all that learning together and share it with other entrepreneurs. At heart, I'm a cheerleader for entrepreneurs and startups. I feel like our future really depends on these startups succeeding. That's the key to having a better climate, better environment, having innovation that actually can help and sustain us. And if we can even tilt the odds of success for these startups a little bit towards success and help these entrepreneurs achieve some of the goals and ambitions that they have, we all win as a society. My daughters will end up living in a better future. So that's kind of all the convoluted thinking that went into pouring the last 5 years into writing this book.
So you wear many different hats, and you've had all these different experiences. What did all of this teach you about the necessity for exit plans?
It really showed me that they're critically vital. Even if you don't want to sell your startup, even if you don't think you would sell your startup, having that option will actually open a lot of doors, will give you a peace of mind. There's actually been a number of studies done on the psychological impact of having a viable alternative. It actually reduces risk and it reduces stress associated with risk. Having that perceived safety net. So it actually opens up your creativity and makes it a lot more possible. Now, startups are not solitary endeavors. We are in a part of an ecosystem. So this exit planning exercise encourages you to think about the ecosystem in which you're operating, the industry, all the various players, and how you fit into that puzzle. So regardless of whether or not you want to sell your startup ultimately, that mindset, thinking from an acquirer perspective, will help you build a much more stronger startup, one that hopefully doesn't even need to sell, but having that option really helps. Also, even if you're going for an IPO, having acquirers at the door makes your IPO prospects a lot better. It is actually benchmarked for valuation. It does help you even in the IPO scenario. So there are very few things you can do as an entrepreneur that minimizes the risk and maximizes your upside in the future. And exit planning, I would say, has that unique flavor to it.
So what does the data show in terms of the likely success of being acquired versus going IPO?
That's a great question. And this is something that I intuited, but I didn't really have the data. It seemed to me that acquisitions are more common than IPOs. And then when I looked at the data, in fact, in the past number of years, 5 years, on average, we've had 30 acquisitions for every IPO. So it really does make it clear that the likely successful outcome for a startup is actually acquisition by a strategic acquirer. Now, we know that most startups fail. In fact, 70% of venture-backed startups don't even return the money invested in them. So the odds are pretty tough, but the success path, the acquisition is a lot more likely on that path. So that was an insight. Another insight that actually a good friend of mine has in his book, Super Founders, Ali Tamaseb, this book came out last year, is that a lot of entrepreneurs, actually those who build billion-dollar plus companies, have had an acquisition in their background of 10 million or more. So if once you get over the hump of having built a company that can be sold for 10 million, you actually are in a position to be a lot more successful the next time around. In fact, the founders of Webs, who sold that company to Vistaprint for $100 million, as I mentioned, their next startup, they sold it for over $1 billion. It was Truebill. And last year, they sold it to rocket companies. So there is a lot of evidence for the benefit of building a company that gets sold. So I can't encourage entrepreneurs enough about this exit planning process.
So then why do you think that exit strategy and planning doesn't rank high on the list of priorities for entrepreneurs then?
Yes, another great question. And you know, the problem here is what I would call an exit taboo. There aren't that many taboo topics in Silicon Valley today, but you know, exit planning and talking about exit has that taboo flavor. And I would say this also is born out of a lot of misunderstandings and myths that surrounds the whole exit process. I would break it down into 5 components that give rise to this taboo. First and foremost, there's a signaling problem. Entrepreneurs are mission driven, right? And they don't want to signal to investors that, hey, look, I'm here to make a quick buck and build to flip, right? This is not like house flipping. This is something that you're pouring your passion, all your creative energies into. And vice versa, investors want to make sure that you are there and you can ride the storms, because every startup has a lot of ups and downs. So both sides are looking for commitment, and therefore a lot of folks worry that bringing up this exit conversation just leaves a wrong impression, especially in the initial courtship phases with investors. I don't recommend people even put that in their slide deck about the exit strategy, because you do need to establish some ground rules and basics and get to know the other side. So that's one reason I would say this conversation doesn't happen. The problem is that exit planning and execution, eventually, and implementation of your exit plan can't happen just with the founders themselves. They do need to have all the stakeholders pulling in the right direction. Their leadership team, their key investors, their board, they need to be all aligned. So that's one problem. The other one is that there's this optimism bias or blind spot where we don't think the statistics necessarily apply to us. I actually surveyed a number of entrepreneurs last year that I knew, and I asked them, hey, what do you think are the chances of success for any one startup? And they all put it in the 0 to 20% range, which is pretty accurate, in line with statistics. After a few questions and distracting them a little bit, I asked them, well, what do you think are the chances of success for your startup? And pretty much everyone thought it's pretty certain that they would succeed, right? So no one believes that these statistics apply to them, and therefore they don't take this necessary to mitigate against risk that they don't think that exists, right? So there's this optimism blind spot, I call it. And I go into details, a lot more details about each of these in the book itself, of course. There is this present bias. So this is number 3 on my list. Present bias basically means that we tend to value short-term outcomes a lot more than long-term, and risk also. We perceive short-term risk a lot more than long-term risks. And what happens then because of this is that we tend to then prioritize what's urgent over what's important. So it keeps getting pushed out until it's too late. And then there's perception also among some entrepreneurs that most acquisitions fail. Not true, but the failure stories tend to get a lot of the media attention and tend to be also more memorable, like the AOL Time Warner or many other acquisitions that Yahoo did, for instance. Again, when you look at the stats, when you look at the numbers, the fact that there are 45,000 acquisitions or more per year, you kind of realize that no, that's not the case. In fact, when they survey the practitioners, people who do deals, and ask them, hey, did this deal, on average, have your deals met your expectations? The answer is yes. So most acquisitions do actually produce their intended results. Ultimately, there is also this perceived lack of agency by some entrepreneurs. They feel that there isn't much they can do about an eventual exit, and that, you know, a big company like Google or Apple or Microsoft, what leverage could they possibly have? So they should just go heads down, execute, and if those guys ever want to acquire them, they'll come to them and they'll deal with it when the time comes. Of course, that's the wrong actually perception. We don't improve what we don't work on, and basically delaying your exit planning just basically means you will have a much less ideal outcome when the time comes. Even if you're lucky enough to be pursued by other acquirers, you're just not prepared to execute on that properly.
Yeah.
So for all these reasons, I would say entrepreneurs need to focus on exit planning, no matter what their stage of their startup. Even if you have just started your company, that should be something in the back of your mind that you give it attention, you cultivate and you grow into it over time. Not drop everything and focus on your exit, but allocate some amount of time towards that. Of course, the closer you are to an eventual exit scenario, you have to allocate more time. But it should never be that you don't allocate any time. Sadly, 4 out of 5 entrepreneurs have spent less than a day thinking or seriously doing anything about their exits. So that needs to change.
So I know one thing that you mentioned was an important lesson that you learned from that first startup of yours was around strategic partnerships and forming strategic partnerships. Tell us why that's an important focus area for entrepreneurs.
When you're an entrepreneur and you just start a company, there is an ecosystem around you. There are other players in the market. They may be competitors, they may be potential allies. You don't really know who is who until you actually get out there, start building relationships and figuring out, okay, well, is there something that we could do together? Just knowing about what other people are doing will make you smarter about what you want to do. And sharing some of your metrics, understanding their aspirations. And as a result of a lot of these conversations, you can come away with potential partnerships that will elevate you. For instance, with Webs, when we decided, for instance, to become a small business-focused platform versus a generic website creation tool, which was that change was actually even another result from that strategic offsite. We went out there and talked to other companies that were addressing the needs of small business. And one thing we realized was that small businesses were trying to figure out how to deal with contact management, relationship management, as well as how to get on these new social networking platforms. So we realized that if we wanted to have a suite of solutions for small businesses, we need to address those needs. And some of them we did through acquisitions of our own. So we acquired a couple of companies. Others we did through partnerships. But we couldn't have done any of that and built a platform that was much better for intended end customers had we not gone out there and talked to the ecosystem players and brought on allies. So you can't do it all as a small startup. You do need to find allies, and strategic partnerships is another word for having allies. Now, lo and behold, some of those conversations may lead into acquisition conversations. You just don't know until you actually establish those relationships and have a cadence and rhythm to your communications. Acquisitions come about when there is a lot of trust, there's a lot of confidence in you and in your abilities and capabilities. So you do need to spend the time with potential acquirers.
Who are those key players that should be targeted as, building relationships with, as allies or as, your strategic partners?
Yes. So big companies are big. They have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, sometimes employees. So different parts of an organization could actually look at you differently and have different needs that you could meet for them. So my recommendation is to get to know as many different departments that are relevant to you as possible. Don't just limit yourself to the business development or corporate development team, although they could be great entry points, but you need to leverage them to get to know that organization better and figure out who are the key decision makers, key potential champions for you within that organization. Get to know as many as possible. Of course, it's time consuming, etc. So you need to be able to filter and kind of pick and choose wisely. Also, there is, as you know, a lot of reorg and other changes that happens within bigger organizations. So if you have one single point of failure, that person may not be there within 6 months or a year. And so you want to cultivate those multiple touch points. Ideally, build even connective tissues, which could be partnership, co-marketing arrangement, a product partnership, technology licensing arrangement, something. So the more interactions you have, the better. And so those would be some just high-level guidance. Again, I go into all of these in a lot more detail in the book.
So what are some of the first steps that entrepreneurs should take to plan their exit path?
I highly recommend that strategy offsite. I have seen such tremendous benefits from it. And I know it seems like a luxury and no one can afford the time or even the mind share that it requires. Hopefully I've made the steps easier by you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I've actually laid out exactly what needs to happen, what is the pre-work for such an offsite, what are the sessions, what is a sample agenda, who do you need to invite, what are the ideal outcomes. I've even a template I call the exit strategy canvas, borrowing from business model canvas, that kind of lays out the core components of what your exit strategy should encompass. So you can actually memorialize and put it down in writing on one page. As we know, if we don't write things down, they don't exist. So a lot of meetings our offsites are very productive, but they're not effective because we don't really capture the actions and takeaways. So you start there, right? You start with really getting crisp as to where is it that you're heading? What is the ideal outcome? What does success really look like? And what are the ingredients for that? I would start there, but I would not finish there. A strategy that's just written down is a statement of good intentions, as Peter Drucker calls it. You have to then implement it over time. And my suggestion for implementation is to just focus on small steps and build momentum. Because when we build momentum, our role as leaders becomes less pushing and more steering. So you want to get into that momentum. And I, again, talk about how to achieve that over time. And the key here is time, because you do need to have time. And this is a process I call the long game of the M&A process. And then when you're about to make a deal, you enter the short game. And there are very different tactics you use at that time. And there's different skill sets even required to effectively negotiate and close a deal.
So then how do entrepreneurs assess when it's the right time to sell their startup? And what factors kind of go into that decision?
Yes, and that's really when you enter the short game, as I just mentioned. So ideally, the right time to sell is when you don't have to sell. So it's very paradoxical, but that's when you get the best outcome. if you have multiple viable options, that's when you have leverage. So one viable option, as we had in my second startup, Webs, was that we were cash flow break even. If you can achieve that, you don't have a gun to your head that you have to sell immediately. Then you can turn around to an acquirer or potential interested party and say, hey, look, love to work with you guys, love to join forces, but we are heads down executing. If you can make us an offer that we can't refuse, or an offer that stops us in our tracks, we're happy to entertain it, right? So you want to be in that leverage position. The other one is, of course, if you have multiple acquirers, that gives you leverage. If you have investors wanting to invest in you, that again, the key here is having viable alternatives, not just going out of business as an alternative, but viable, good alternatives. That's a great time. Now, there are a couple of ingredients that have to come together for an acquisition to actually come to fruition. One is that you have to be willing to sell. And you, not just the founder, but actually your team, your leadership, your key stakeholders, your board, you all need to be aligned. So you need to kind of bring everyone along the journey and make sure everyone is ready to kind of support you in that. The other one is that you have to have willing buyers. Again, you need to cultivate that willingness and relationship over time. And there needs to be a set of terms that everyone can agree to. For these three to coincide, for it to be the right time to sell, it takes a lot of work. It takes a set of circumstances coming together. There are a lot of positives to selling. There are, of course, always negatives to selling. And each entrepreneur, each startup would evaluate the pros and cons differently. I lay them out in the book as a starting point as to, hey, what are the things that other people consider in support or against selling their startup? But again, each team would have to evaluate those differently based on how they assess risks, how they assess opportunities, what their mission is, how they think they can best fulfill that mission.
How do entrepreneurs know when it's okay to walk away from a potential offer because they don't know if they're going to get a better deal?
That is really a tough one. And ideally, right, the best time to walk away is when you have other alternatives. Now, there are some times that you are so far apart from a potential acquirer, either in your vision of where the joint combined entity should go, the values are incompatible, the cultures are incompatible, that you just know in your gut, just like you would know with, let's say, even an investor, potential investor, or potential hire, that look, I don't think this is going to work out. Then I think you should listen to your gut. But the best time to walk away is when you have other alternatives that are equally good for your startup, which means that you need to cultivate those things. You need to always have options, because let's say if you get an inbound interest and you haven't thought about these options, you have to jump into action. You have to bring that to your board. You have to start seriously considering that inbound interest in your fiduciary obligations as the leader. And if you haven't done the pre-work, you may actually, in your deliberations, lose a very tangible opportunity. So you have to have had some frameworks in place to be able to assess what is a good opportunity for you versus not a great one.
What is wrong with the typical definition of success for a startup?
A lot of times when we kind of think about success, or we're trying to quantify that in research, people tend to just look at numbers, valuation metrics. This acquisition was X millions or billions of dollars. But I think ultimately entrepreneurs start their companies because they had a mission, they had a vision, and no entrepreneur really starts something because they just want to make a quick buck or quickly sell it to someone. They really start something because it tugged at their heartstrings, and they believe that this thing should exist, that the world needs this product or this service, right? So to me, the definition of success should really align, and does really align, with what that initial founding mission for the startup was. And successful exits, in my opinion, are those that help the entrepreneur further that mission and achieve their vision even more. We, as a lot of startup entrepreneurs, don't have all the resources to make that dream truly come true. It's a lot of times, more often than not, the bigger companies that have the resources, that have the customer acquisition funnels. They can, for instance, GoDaddy. At GoDaddy, we had cracked the code on acquiring small businesses. In fact, it cost us much less than anybody else in the industry to acquire a small business. But that happened over time, over hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in brand equity, with people really thinking about GoDaddy as a place to get a domain name, right? So for a small business, it's for even a startup, it's not possible to acquire customers the way GoDaddy acquires them. Now, GoDaddy had this massive funnel of millions of small businesses coming in its door every year. It didn't have all the products to sell to those small businesses. So they were very eager, in my team, we were very eager to look at other innovative technology solutions that we could bring into the fold that would offer to our customers. And so we're very acquisitive. We did, in my tenure there, we did over 20 acquisitions, and GoDaddy continues to make acquisitions. So, and there are many other, big companies out there that are looking for innovation and things that they can bring into the fold. And I mentioned a lot of examples in the book. So those are the kind of acquisitions I would say that are successful because they align the vision of the founders and the startup with the ultimate mission of also the acquirer.
So tell us a little bit about valuations and what goes into valuations that justify some companies you'll see are valued at these really astronomical numbers, and startups that are doing similar things in similar industries are valued at much lower. So what goes into that?
Yes, and it's a very painful reminder of, again, what happened to my first startup, because we weren't the only one that had that epiphany about the benefit of social networks and telephony coming together. In fact, there were 3 other startups that started around in the same year. They founded in the same year, and they pursued a bit of a different strategy, which I think you would guess by now. They actually pursued more partnership-driven strategy rather than viral growth. And for those startups, actually, they got amazing valuations. And one of them sold to, for instance, Google. The Grand Central sold to Google. It became Google Voice. That was somewhere in the $50 to $100 million valuation with very little revenue. Then a year after that, Ribbit, another competitor, sold to British Telecom. This was in 2008, I believe, right before the Great Recession. And they sold it before they had even launched their product for £100 million. And then right after our demise, Jaja, another competitor, which I would say didn't have as great a technology. Maybe I'm biased, but this is how I see it. They sold for $200 million to Telefonica, again, with very little revenues and in the midst of the Great Recession too. So what happened to us? Again, we had not taken the time to cultivate those relationships. Those other startups had leverage. They were in a position that they had money. They didn't have to sell. Like Jaja had just raised money from Sequoia. They were okay. So the acquirer would have to, if they really needed that service or product, they needed to pay a premium for it. For us, because we didn't have any other options, the acquirer could dictate their terms. So leverage is the name of the game. And the way to build that leverage, there are many ingredients and components to it, but the most important one is that if you have options, you can walk away from a deal.
So I'm going to shift a little here and ask you some of your work experiences that you found were most beneficial to your career trajectory. And what is some advice that you have for entrepreneurs?
One thing I have really been proud of, and one of the benefits of having done Jackster, despite the hard lessons learned, is that we had amazing interns, like seniors in college that came and joined us for a summer or joined us right after college, and they have gone on to be amazing serial entrepreneurs in their own right, selling their startups at very, very successfully selling, actually acquiring other startups. And I'm so proud of them because I feel like in a small part, the lessons they learned while they saw the Jackster story unfold was critical to their subsequent successes as well. So one thing I would say is exposure to startups. Having been within a startup as an intern or as a new entrant to the job market is always a great thing. You don't really get much hands-on job training, I would say, but you do absorb a lot and you see a lot, and it gives you a very interesting perspective. So that's one of the lessons I have for a lot of folks who are entering the job market, is that at least do an internship at a startup and see what it's all about. In my own career trajectory, having had the more liberal arts education, I would say, has been super helpful. So I'm a big proponent of liberal arts in colleges. I hope they don't get pushed out by the more technical disciplines, because they broaden your perspective. They help you see interrelations between concepts, and especially as tasks are becoming more and more automated with AI. I feel that we need to have the ability to step out a little bit and see the connection between our technologies and our society and our values, and what kind of future do we want to build together. So highly encourage anyone to take actually 1 or 2 or even minor or major in philosophy as an undergrad. There are many successful entrepreneurs out there with a philosophy degree. So that's another one. Legal background is helpful. I mean, we live in a country that's built on laws. Understanding them and appreciating the frameworks and the constraints within which we operate, or how we need to evolve those constraints, is always very helpful. I don't recommend that every entrepreneur should get a law degree, but some exposure to the legal thinking is super helpful. And I found that to be very helpful to me, even though I'm not a practicing lawyer. I haven't been one for many years. I do appreciate the fact that I've had that legal background.
So many great insights, and what a great book, Touraj. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for all the great questions.
Yeah. And we'll see you next time on Sarder TV.